Welcome everybody to Design Thinking Meets Org Design. My name is Nicole Desain and I am the founder of the HR Hackathon Alliance. I'm curious, raise your hand if this is your first HR Hackathon Alliance event. All right, so we've got quite a few people. So I just want to say a few words about who we are. Welcome. So the HR Hackathon started in 2017 when I was still the president of Disrupt HR Chicago, and we got feedback from the community that they wanted more than just the TED Talk style events, and that coincided with me learning about design thinking and really getting excited about introducing the method to HR. So I designed the HR Hackathon, which is a 2-hour ideation session in essence, where a company brings their workplace challenge, and then we invite 20 to 50 people to ideate solutions around it. And so we've hacked, topics from diversity to employee experience, leadership development, you name it. So we did that for 2 years and we got really great feedback. People really loved it who attended our Chicago events. So I decided to scale the format to other cities. Right now we are in 7 cities and counting. And we have created over 700 ideas in the last few years, which is really, really cool. And during the pandemic, we've expanded our in-person signature HR hackathons to include virtual events like this one. And so at this point, we have 3,600 global members. So welcome, one of them as well. So hopefully you enjoyed today's virtual panel discussion. We could not do these events without our partners and sponsors. So today's event is sponsored by Proco Talent Agency. Thank you so much. And we have Liz Debley, Proco's founder, with us. Liz, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, nobody came to hear me talk, so I'm going to keep this really short. But basically, the Proco Agency is a talent matchmaking service where we match high quality, world-class consultants like the 3 you'll meet on this panel today with Fortune 1000 companies. We specialize in organizational effectiveness. The way to think of Proco is a little bit like creative artist agency in Hollywood represents the top actors. We represent the top consultants who specialize in org effectiveness so that they can focus on the work, not on business development and compliance and insurance and contracting and invoicing and collections and all the other stuff that is involved with running your own business. So that's a little bit about how Proco works. All of our talent are highly vetted. They all have at least 15 years of experience, many 20 or more. And we have a crazy model where our agency fee is only 10%. So it's very unique. But with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Nicole. I'm going to take myself off camera because this is not my show. This is about our talent, our specialists in organizational effectiveness and org design.
Thank you so much, Liz. And yeah, so just want to give folks a little bit of background how this topic came about. So Liz and I were talking what might be a good combination, I guess, of topics, between design thinking and what Proco represents. And so we were tossing around change management and org design. We landed on org design and change management. And it was interesting because I think a couple of weeks later, Gartner came out with their top 23 HR trends, and org design and change management made the top 5 list. So our crystal ball worked out, Liz. But so I'm approaching this topic, so I'm going to facilitate the panel. But so I have expertise in design thinking, but I don't know this much about org design. So I'm going to approach this conversation with the design thinking mindset of curiosity. And as we bring the panelists on, we're going to sort of explore how these two methods, frameworks sort of align and coexist. So I invite you all on this journey with us together. And by the way, we received so many incredible questions. Thanks to those of you who submitted those. I'm going to try my best to infuse them in our conversation. If you haven't had a chance or you don't hear your questions answered, please put them in the chat. We'll get to them in a little bit. And we might not be able to answer all of them, but that's okay. We'll provide a chance that you can connect with the panelists later as well. So with that said, let's do a round robin of introductions. So if you all could just go around, and let's start with Seema. Do a sort of a brief intro of yourself, and as well share with us, what is your favorite part of doing org design work?
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, everyone. My name is Seema Patel. I'm based out of New York City. I am a consultant who focuses on all sorts of people-related issues, as well as a leadership coach. And what I find the most fun around org design is the dialogue I have with clients about how they do the work, both formally and informally, in service of their organization's strategy and mission. So really getting a deep understanding of like the end-to-end work as well as the employee experience.
Super, thank you so much. Cynthia, you want to go next?
Sure, thank you. My name is Cynthia Escamilla, and I'm from Portland, Oregon. And my consulting does specialize in organizational design. I was in HR for 25 years and really fell into the practice of organization design when I was an HR business partner. And so got my certification, started learning it. And so I've been practicing it for about 15 years now. So it's, the reason I love it is it's like a puzzle. And I love puzzles. And so it's about kind of looking at all the different parts of the organization and trying to figure out what lever to move that will increase the effectiveness. And then I'd say the second thing is I love teaching about org design. And so I'm really excited to be here with you all to talk about the topic. So thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, welcome. And Jody, last but not least.
Thanks, Nicole, and also thanks, Liz, for making this all happen. I'm Jody Goulden from Org Design Works, and we help leaders in organizations to design their organizations to have greater impact. And we do that by taking them through a kind of step-by-step approach of looking at all the different parts of the organization. And well, the thing that I really love about doing this work is that I really believe that companies, that organizations have the chance to be a force for good in the world. But what I know from my own experience working inside those companies is that with all the talented, amazing, motivated people in the companies, sometimes it feels like you're kind of just swimming upstream. It feels like there's all this bureaucracy and hierarchy and politics to navigate. And so what I found is organization design is the key to kind of unleashing the chance for people and for organizations to make a difference. So that's why I get excited about this kind of work.
Love it. Thank you so much. So I thought we could get started with just some level setting around, general terms. Cynthia, why don't you share with us, what is org design? I'm sure there's more to it than just moving around boxes on an org chart. I'm being facetious,
It is much
but
more.
I'm sure there's more of a science to it.
Yeah.
You want to get us started with the definition a little bit?
Yeah, there's an art and science to it, I would say. And the way to think about organization design is that you're basically looking at a holistic view of your organization. So really, what I say when I look at an organization is the organization set up purposefully or accidentally, depending on what your strategy is. And so when you look at organization design, it's a purposeful, holistic look at the way that you work from a structural perspective, process, metrics, talent, capabilities. So you have a holistic view of the organization and really figuring out how to approach fixing or improving or creating more efficiencies. There are a lot of different models that you might have heard of. Every big consulting company has their own model, the BCG model, the McKinsey model. Accenture has now their own model. There is the STAR model. There's a lot of organization design models. So it's just a way, again, think of it as a holistic view of how do I look at the different parts other than the boxes. On top of the boxes are important, but really it's the holistic view and really, how am I bringing my strategy to life in the different aspects of the organization that I live in.
Great. Thank you so much for grounding us in that. And Jody, how do you help leadership understand that, it's not just about moving boxes around on an org chart?
Yeah. Yeah. So if I put myself in the shoes of a leader who's sitting there going, okay, I need to change my org chart. Please help me to put the boxes in the right places and to rewrite that org chart. That's feeling like it's something really important and urgent to me. And you have to acknowledge that that is really important, right? So that's one of the likely outcomes of going through an org design approach. So I want to kind of reassure that leader that if you take a look at the whole organization, as Cynthia said, looking at all the parts of it to understand how it's going to support this strategy, then one of the outcomes that you'll get is an organization chart. So it's very concrete, tangible outcome. And there's some other tangible outcomes that are really important that are coming out of org design, like an implementation plan or a roadmap for how you're going to implement those changes, and probably a communication plan or a strategy about how you're going to engage people in the change and what are the reasons why you have the change. So those are all really important outcomes that leaders get. And I think that's a good conversation to have with leaders who are really interested in the outcomes. Sometimes it's challenging to have the conversation to say, well, we have to go really slow and look at all parts of the organization, and it might be a big project, but really help them to see how it's going to help them get the things that they really need.
And I love that, to really explain to them what are the tangible outcomes, because it can sound kind of vague, right? Org design is something, high pie in the clouds, but like, what is the actual tangible thing, if you will, that I get out of it? So I think that's that's really helpful for people to understand, I think, and to have in their pockets. Seema, can you share with us how has the post-COVID world changed real life org design, and is it here to stay?
Yes, I think the post-COVID world really has made leaders rethink, and we've all heard the buzzwords about being more agile. So I think they're really questioning if their org design is agile enough to adapt to whatever the new thing might be. So while it was COVID for us most recently, and there are still some companies who are experiencing through that, I think they're rethinking, what does agility look like for all of us if we were to integrate that into our org design? And just based on a recent example that I worked on with the client, some things that were really highlighted were how clear were stakeholders on their integrated business processes. So as you're thinking about org design, they were taking a much more holistic view of how do we work, not just our own business processes, but how do we look across the business, take a more end-to-end view of what's critical for how we are approaching org design, right? So taking much more of a process-based focus, which would really help them understand, like, what is the most valuable work as we start to design roles to deliver on the work itself. I think another key component that the world that we're living in now has really highlighted was collaboration. So really thinking about knowledge sharing and how do you actually integrate that into the design of organizations. So that might look like, roles might have some semblance of job sharing with other roles so that people can step in and support each other as needed, given circumstances that might happen externally. They're really rethinking information flow. And with that, rethinking just how do you actually leverage technology to support how we collaborate, how we share knowledge, and how we ensure information is flowing to support how the work gets done. The other thing that's important for many leaders now is just exploring ways in which to shape the workforce. So rethinking who needs to be full-time versus part-time, who could be contract, what can be outsourced, who are seasonal workers. And then I think to be more competitive, a component of org design that, just to ensure you're able to attract talent, career pathing and opportunities for growth has become like a big theme. As you know, the talent field is definitely wider, but people are looking for places where they could not just come into, but also see pathways for either upward mobility or global mobility. And so that's where incentives and benefits also comes into play from an org design perspective.
So that's really interesting, because that's really, thank you for that, because it showcases to us the broadness of what org design is, right? You share things from the way we work to how we are structured to how the workforce is, what the workforce is comprised of. So I think that's a real great example. And certainly all the things that you mentioned, with the second part of this question, is this here to stay? I would say yes, right? I think so many things are, are going to be changed forever. Do you agree with that, or?
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think it's, the client that I had worked with didn't have a methodology on how to approach org design. It was recently rolled out. And so I think as strategy is being discussed at the organizational level, to just sort of reinforce what Cynthia said earlier, right? You have to take a holistic view, and thinking about your org design strategy should be, very closely integrated and connected to that.
Yeah. And just a reminder for everybody, please put your questions in the chat and make sure you post it to everyone. Let me just see, we got a question that was just posted to me, if I want to add that right now. Somebody said, good point around how do you support one another more, not less? Collaborate instead of silos, as remote and hybrid work are so very much our reality going forward. Yep. What does the org look like, and how does it behave in these new circumstances? I think that's a great summary of what you just said. Thank you, Cheryl, for adding that in the chat. The next question I'm going to read, because it's such an excellent question we got for Cynthia. Do you see a divergence between traditional org design, for example, designing an org to best fulfill its purpose in the market, and more new work approaches, for example, creating more humane and inclusive organizations? If so, how can we bridge that gap, especially considering the Great Resignation and people not only willing to put up anymore with top-down hierarchies that constantly seem to fail? I wanted to read that one because it's such a, oh, you wrote that, Julian? Okay.
Yeah.
What a great prompt.
It is a great question.
I did not want to paraphrase that because it's so
Yeah.
well written. So you want to take that on, Cynthia?
Yeah, and I love it because the way that I was looking to answer is as far as, I think, so it's more of a convergence versus a divergence. So you're always going to have the need to revisit your strategy. If a strategy changes or your company is in a growth mode, there's always an evolution to the way that the company evolves with it. And I think that there is an evolution to the approach of designing, and that is being more inclusive in including more people into that process, where it's usually a top-down executives in a room making decisions about where the boxes go, where people go, things like that. Where I do see more inclusion in, let's get more people involved in the design process. And that's a practice that I encourage. Example, whenever I do an HR reorganization, I try to get HR to include business people in that design team, because they're the clients in a lot of HR programs and services. And so there is, I think, a lot of opportunity to include people in the process. And we're going to talk about kind of the process of what's a typical process. And one of it is a diagnostic, right? So what's the problem you're trying to solve? Who are you including in that question? Are you including people who are actually part or receiving your products and services within the company, your employees? Who are you including in the design? Who are you including in implementation? So there's a lot of different ways to bring people along the process. And this goes a little with the change management question, but I see it's definitely more of a convergence versus divergence of top down versus it's an and
Mhm.
with the design.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
And we'll
And I
get
want
to
to,
that.
Nicole, can I speak to something earlier too
Yeah.
about something that Seema talked about relative to collaboration.
Mhm.
So this is something that as you think about organization design and as you think about collaboration, this is what I think also what COVID and the pandemic, everybody's kind of in their offices. You have to be really purposeful in building collaboration. It just doesn't happen. So this is something that I think is a big aha for leaders as you go through the organization design process. It's not just about the structure. Regardless of whatever structure you create a silo. Every structure creates a silo. You have to create integration and build integration and collaboration across those silos. A lot of times what you hear leaders saying, well, they'll go figure it out. They won't, or it'll take a long time and it's going to cost a lot of time and money for them to figure it out, right? And so that's you have to build the collaboration networks, whether it's a virtual team, whether it's a committee, whatever it is, you have to build the collaboration. So that's what I think is a really critical component. And as you do design thinking as well, as far as how do you break down those barriers, I hear a lot of the end-to-end experiences. That's definitely a way to do that. And as you do that, you figure out where are the handoffs, who's going to take the baton from one division to another.
Mhm.
So that's what I would just wanted to speak up about that on collaboration.
Super. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So now let's make it a little bit more tangible. I know especially if you're new to something, people like to have some tangible examples. So let's talk a little bit about what are key pain points that org design addresses, and if you can share, examples or case studies without necessarily naming companies. Jody, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Yeah. I want to link it even back to what Cynthia was talking about when Cynthia, when you talked about what is org design, and I think you said something around it's to help the company achieve its strategic direction or purpose. And that's one of the things when you talk about pain points is that when you're going into an org design project, there is a shift in strategic direction that you're trying to support. That might not always come up as the pain point at the beginning, right?
Mhm.
But that's what you have to go, that's what you're kind of on a voyage of discovery to figure out. So just to make that concrete, some of the recent projects that I've worked on have had these are kind of examples of a strategic change of direction without saying, without revealing who the companies are. But one is a company that traditionally has processed raw materials into more refined materials, and they have switched strategically to more processing of recycled materials. So that's a whole change in their strategy and the way that they do things. Another example is a company that has been really successful focusing on quality of products in North America and in Europe with a high margin. And their new strategy is to expand their business by focusing on more stability and price competitiveness in Africa and Asia. So all those things they trigger the need for organizing the company differently. But in the first instance, conversations and symptoms, you'll get symptoms of those changes, and they tend to sound a bit different. They tend to sound like things like, well, we're too slow, it takes us too long to make decisions, people are not collaborating across silos, and so we can't get things done. Maybe there's new competitors and startups that are disrupting our industry. We need to be more flexible and agile. Or those are the kind of pain points and symptoms that people are often talking about. So that's where there's a need to come in with a really curious mindset, ask a lot of questions and get an understanding of what is the What is the strategy change that's there? And I think that when org design kicks in, when that strategic change is kind of a matter of survival for the company. That might sound dramatic, but if you start asking questions like, well, what will happen if we don't change? You will start to get answers, especially from senior leaders, like, well, we're not going to be able to compete in the market. We're not going to be able to survive. So that's when you've really got that strong need for change.
Yeah, thanks for that excellent sort of distinguishing of, and it seems to me, as not being in org design, obvious that if you change your business model, your strategy, that an org design effort might be required. But then there are other examples that you shared that maybe are not as obvious. And you said to approach it with the curious mindset. I just want to double click on that a little bit more. What advice or tips do you have for people to uncover those things, or to have those conversations, I guess, to get to the real pain points that are underneath?
Yeah, I'm going to come back on that one, because just to even make it concrete with an example, one of those projects that I just mentioned, one of those examples, it actually started with a conversation with a leader who said, I need to change my organization chart because I have too many direct reports. So that's kind of, I mean, that you can kind of understand that, okay, it's logical, I'm too busy. So what are the kind of questions that came up in the conversation that led to understanding that there's a strategic change behind? The questions are things like, well, what is it that's taking up all of your time? Or what is it that, what is on your plate? And it turns out that that leader was spending a lot of time doing due diligence for potential acquisitions and integrations, because their new strategy said that they needed to build new business models in new markets and to acquire companies to do that. And then some more questioning about what are the kind of topics that get escalated to your desk, that revealed that the leadership team is spending too much time on operational issues because decision-making responsibility is not clearly defined. And in a big matrix organization, no one knows who's making the decision and everyone's trying to align with each other. And so the operations is taking up too much time. So some of the outcomes of that project, there was a new organization chart, but there also was a lot of other changes around capability, decision-making processes, strategic understanding, and those kind of things.
Thank you for sharing that example. I think that really illustrates it well. And this is, and we're going to get to it in a little bit, but to me, that's also an intersection to human-centered design, the curious mindset and the asking questions and uncovering real root causes. So thank you for that. With innovation, many organizations have innovation and constant change on their minds. Cynthia, where does org design come in when it gets to these sort of topics?
So Nicole, are you saying with regards to, innovation relative to innovation in and of itself or innovation as part of organization design?
I think innovation as the big
outcome.
The big, exactly.
I call
and
it
where
big
does
eye,
org
little
design come in there? Yeah, exactly.
So there's a few approaches, I think, for innovation, because a lot of companies want to have this innovative mindset process, ways that I can do work differently, my products and services, how can I improve them using innovation? And one of the areas that I always look at is how, where does innovation sit within the organization? Is it an R&D, and you let me know if I'm answering the question correctly here, but is it an R&D or is it part of a product group? So one of the things that to think through is how are you segmenting your time and energy to those to the products and services that will provide innovation. So that is one way to think about it. And I don't know if you're familiar with this book called Zone to Win. but it's a really good reference to how to think about innovation and where you can segment innovation, where you're always going to have part of the company that's going to deliver on your products and services, right? What are your basics? But then when you think about how do you evolve, how do you innovate, there is a certain, I call it big I, little I. Do you have groups that are actually just going off and thinking about that on their own, and then they come in with their ideas, or are they embedded in the organization in itself? And then how do you give them space and resources to be able to grow? So that's the way to think about that in that topic. So I'm not sure if that's, what the question intended. So I just want to make sure that we're answering that.
Yep. So if anybody is here who asked that question, feel free to clarify. If to me that was clear, and thank you. But feel free to put it in the comments if this did not answer it. And Seema, I'm curious. We talked about post-COVID world, but is there anything that you're seeing specifically when it comes to hybrid work and how that affects org design and effectiveness?
I think just to build on what Cynthia was talking about earlier around collaboration, I'm seeing the interest when it comes specifically to role descriptions to integrate handoffs with other teams, specific responsibilities as it relates to who might be on point to engage those who might not be based at that particular location. So really building it into role descriptions on how do you ensure that there is connectivity within teams and then with key stakeholders, right? So as you do take a more end-to-end view of how the work gets done, are we as a team, connected to all of our critical stakeholders to ensure that work is happening the way that it's intended? So I've seen that become more of a theme. The other thing is around just team formation, right? So now many teams are not even in the same location. So being able to manage dispersed teams and the impact that has on just leadership and how you are actually enabling leaders to just lead differently in the world that we are living in and working in today. There's also the implication around mobility. What mobility means today is very different than what it meant like 3, 4, 5 years ago. So I think there's still a thirst for people to have, and what I mean by mobility is not just within the company, but also physical location wise. So just greater desire for mobility to work from spaces and places that they want to work from, recognizing that remote work is more acceptable today. And I think there are a lot of people who are making the case for that in this post. And so from an org design perspective, I think it really, as you're thinking about accountability and decision making, I think there's greater clarity around who is actually the decision maker, who's responsible for what. I'm almost thinking more of like a traditional RACI model where there's greater clarity around who's accountable, responsible, consulted, and informed, and integrating that model into supporting how org design gets done, right? Am I checking the boxes? Are people clear on what they need to do in this hybrid work environment?
Great, thank you so much. And we got a question in the chat that I wanted to toss out to any of you who want to respond to it from Rochelle, who says, where do you see psychological safety fitting into org design, especially relating to change? And is anyone purposefully doing or considering this right now?
I'll kick off and let Jody and Cynthia kind of chime in. I think it starts with the transparency component. Really being clear on what you're doing and why. If you're leveraging external partners, setting them up for success with clear introductions on how they are interfacing with, stakeholders in the organization. So that's one of the things that I really enjoy is talk to the people who are doing the work. Today, understand, really understand their experience. And oftentimes, because if you're a consultant, they're going to open up more easily to you, assuming that there's some confidentiality and, going to the question, psychological safety, right? So just enabling consultants to set guardrails to open up the floor for as much input as possible, but also being clear with leaders as to what gets vetted upwards, right? So respecting confidentiality as we're learning about user experience. But I think being transparent about what is org design, right? So even explaining it transparently, because oftentimes most people aren't engaged. And I think Cynthia said this earlier, right? It's, you got to engage the people in the process.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for taking that one.
Yeah.
So let's get even more tangible now. What are the steps you follow in a typical org design project, and how do you manage change throughout the process? Cynthia, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, and Seema, I just love what you said about, I think this also has to do with the psychological safety, right? As far as that communication plan, the best change management I've seen is when you introduce change management at the beginning of this process. And so, normally you would start with, and the typical steps are 4 to 5 milestones. You'll see lots of different milestones, but it usually includes, one is a diagnostic. What's the problem that you're trying to solve? A lot of times, how many times is the presenting problem not the underlying issue, right? So that's like, what's the problem that you're trying to solve? So that's the first step. The second step that I usually do is then, okay, so based on the diagnostic and assessment that I've done, are there structural changes? Where is the work shifting? Where does it need to go? So there's a lot of work around what's the organizational model of the future. So what is that? Like Jody said, are there new business units, or are there new regions that need to be added? There was a client that came to me and said, I need to collapse my retail and e-commerce organization. It's like, well, okay, that the work's going to change based on that project. So you figure out, what is my structure? What does that look like in the end? So that's usually the second step in that process. The third one is what we've already talked about. How do you create integration across the processes? So it's not just the structure that you're creating. You have to identify what those key processes are that will enable your structure to work. A lot of times organization designs also, it comes to you because, oh my gosh, I'm implementing a new ERP, so I've got to connect everything together. And that's usually traditionally how you've seen org design. But that is something where, again, what are those networks? What are those collaboration areas that you're creating in order for that structure to work? So that's the third step. The fourth is usually, it's the talent conversation. What are the skills? What's this talent that's going to go into this organization? And notice that it's the fourth step, not the first. And this is what also happens Jody is going to be the marketing director, and I need Jody to stay the marketing director, kind of that conversation.
Designing around the person
And
versus
designing around a person is not org design. That is just, let's be clear. And so that is, so you have to really think about the skills and capabilities that you need now for this new organization. And I have to give, this is where HR really comes into play, and the leadership, as far as, do you have good talent management practices and processes that would help support the change that's needed in the organization to develop the skills that you need? You hear a lot about the new digital, how do we build digital capability? How do you build planning capability? Fill in the blank. So how do you then populate your new beautiful design with the talent that you need? And then the last process, which is actually the beginning, is the implementation and transition. So then you go into, all right, I've got my design, I understand what processes I need to fix, and they're probably still fixing them as you go into the talent development and talent filling the roles that you need to, and then going into the implementation. What does that activation look like? How do I build my new leadership teams? How do I activate my new leadership teams? How do I keep everybody engaged as they change the way that they do the work that they used to do before? How do I go from to, right? So there's a lot of communication and connection with that. So the whole change management aspect of this is I have had teams, I've had companies and clients that I've worked with that actually brought in the communication at the beginning of the process. And there was one client that I just loved that actually did videos after each design session that we did. It was just, and they just talked about like, this is what we did. You know, there's no decisions yet, but that, and I think that's what makes leaders nervous. It's like, well, we're not really saying anything, but you actually are. You're saying kind of where you are in the process and what are you looking at, or what are the factors? What is the design elements that you're looking at? So I understand what's happening. Even this happened to me actually when I was at Nike, and HR came out and said, we're going to go to a new model. We're going to go to an HR business partner model that's really grounded in org design. And this was like 18 years ago. And I'm like, oh, well, I best go figure out like where I need to go pick up that skill if that's what I want to do in the future. So that is, I've heard one leader called it radical transparency. And so that's something that I think is really important. And as you think about transitioning to the new way of working.
And I love that because that also, I think, contributes to the psychological safety and trust, right?
Absolutely.
So people don't feel like things are happening behind closed doors.
Yeah.
Leaders are showing vulnerability, transparency. Yeah, super. I want to make the transition to design thinking, or now starting to bring the two together. And Seema, how might we prototype an org design? So prototyping is what we usually do one step in the design thinking process when we have ideated and now we want to sort of have a, we call it sometimes a facade, where the lifelike facade of the final solution that people can interact with and give feedback, for those who don't know design thinking. Seema, how might that apply to org design?
So as I listened to Jody kind of share her examples around some of the changes, like strategic changes some organizations were going to make, I think the first thing is, as you're thinking about doing prototyping, like what is going to minimize business disruption, right? And really engaging your leaders and stakeholders on the watch points and the criteria to like move forward with actually a prototype, right? So, and I think just building on what Cynthia said, right, there's this change management effort, but, you know, I often look at org design as org design in transition, right? So that how do you actually transition? What is that readiness effort to even do a prototype? Because if it truly means taking people out of role or changing roles or moving them, the question is, are things going to fall apart? Will something be forgotten? So I think being very clear around what's going to minimize business disruption, as well as having the org design, the org readiness effort clear, may help you pick what prototype to pursue. I think safely, you know, for a particular client, they were launching an HR service center. We spent a lot of time just doing day in the life simulations, right? So people kind of, you know, adopt the future role, and you're all in a room together and you're literally doing simulations of what the future work is going to look like to identify lessons learned, opportunities, but also strengths and what's working well to maximize that in the future. And then I think, you know, if it's a process-driven organization, you might be able to prototype one specific process, but there's a lot of work to get the multiple stakeholders engaged. And, you know, a client I worked with, they were launching new global shared service centers, and their desire was to start with one center before opening up all the centers. So I don't want to necessarily say they were prototyping, but they were piloting and or easing into a new way of working before actually sort of scaling it or folding in more of the organization into these new centers.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing those examples. And to me, it also seems like there's like related mindsets, both in org design and design thinking. I mean, both have design in the term, so that's probably why. But so as I reflect back on everything that was said so far, the notion of whom are we including and who do we need to co-create with? right? I think that's a common thread to me. The thing around experimentation, right? The notion that we want to stay curious and ask questions. So those are some of the themes that I already picked up where those two come together. But I'm curious, Jody, can you share an example of when has design thinking added real value in an org design process that you worked on? And when should we use it and maybe when not to use it? That's sometimes good to know too.
Yeah, we've really already been talking about the part that for me, I think has potentially the most impact, and that's bringing in the aspect of empathy that's coming from design thinking mindset, which is really, it's definitely already a theme of this whole conversation, is about including more people, more voices in the design process so that you've got all of those diverse perspectives. So organization design shouldn't be happening behind closed doors with a small group of people, because even if they are the smartest people that you've ever met, they still only have their own perspective on the organization. And the way you want to design an organization is to understand, what does it feel like to be working in the corporate headquarters? What does it feel like to be working on a customer site or in all the different parts of the organization? So being able to engage more people in the process, and that could be through stakeholder interviews, it could be through focus groups, it could be through workshops, it could be through customer journeys. There's a lot of different ways to do that, and I think we can probably learn a lot from design thinking when it comes to finding ways to do that, and being able to facilitate those ways of engaging in where you are being a really, really good listener is really key. And then it comes back to Rochelle's question on psychological safety, because you need to have psychological safety to be able to do that. And of course, I think probably everyone here is nodding and agreeing, going, yeah, we need psychological safety. But in reality, very often in an organization design situation, you're working against a backdrop of cost cutting and headcount reductions. And even in my little example of where a leader is saying, well, I need to reduce the number of my direct reports. And then you imagine that you're in that person's leadership team. Are you still feeling safe right now? When you need to go into a process to start talking about the future organization. So I think it requires a really careful and skilled way of setting up the whole approach so that you are able to provide the right environment with good listening to get more people engaged in that.
I love that. Thank you. Are there scenarios where we might not want to use design thinking methods and mindsets?
To me, I think we always should be trying to engage people and create psychological safety. So no.
Yeah. Seema, what are some tactics or strategies that can help garner leadership buy-in for design thinking techniques in org design?
Yeah, I'll build on what Jody was just, sharing around the focus groups and getting different feedback from different groups of stakeholders. But I find testimonials really powerful, right? To help leaders understand what is the employee experience, what's working, what are the pain points. So I think that's always very useful. Obviously, many leaders also appreciate having like hard data. So just thinking about what are the different like engagement surveys, looking at retention data, are people leaving because of what they might experience as stagnation in the organization? So a client I'm working with, people have been in roles for like 5+ years, and they're just like, the way the teams are designed, there's no upward mobility. You've got to move a department. And so just thinking about exit interviews and why are people leaving? So culling through that data, sharing data around decision-making timelines, like how quickly do things get done, right? So I think leaders like to understand also the information flow. So I think sharing some data will certainly get their attention. And then I think it's hard sometimes to prototype and pilot or design, because you literally are changing people's jobs potentially, or creating new teams, etc. But I think doing small scale pilots could help build some confidence. Again, with a lot of very strong change management and opportunities for feedback. So I think it's really important to ensure that you're establishing feedback channels throughout the process. So it doesn't feel like it's a one-way, but it's a two-way to talk about what are some things that maybe they just didn't anticipate, right? So now that we're live, so to speak, ensuring that there are feedback channels and opportunities to make improvements moving forward.
Mm-hmm. I love those techniques and examples that you share. Thank you. We had a question around skills, which I also really liked. What type of design thinking skills do you think are beneficial to have to do org design work? And what would be some ways you'd recommend for me to develop these skills? Any resources or anything that you can recommend? Cynthia, do you want to take that one?
Sure. The skills that I think that I've heard and that, based what you guys have been talking about is the listening, actually, the active listening and the empathy that comes with design thinking you guys already have, right? This whole concept of also inclusion and having that human-centered approach is very key to being a good designer. And the other area that I was listening to was just the collaboration and how you build collaboration throughout the process. And so that is something, as you work in org design, then you actually grow your collaboration over the process, right? So you have your inquiry, then you've got the design, then you've got the process work. And so it keeps adding on as far as the groups and the teams that you continue to involve. So it's just an ongoing area. Mm-hmm. The way to develop, there's a lot of different courses and classes, and I can put some of them in the chat, but there's there's the expensive classes through USC Center of Effective Organizations that have that. Cornell has an org design program specifically to set up, just kind of for beginning. A lot of good areas there. There is nonprofit, and total transparency, Jody and I are on the board of Organization Design Forum. So it's organizationdesignforum.org. It's committed to practitioners of organization design, where you can go and there's a toolkit on the website just to get you started, some books that are recommended on there that you could go and build your skills. So a lot of different areas, and feel free to reach out to Seema, Jody, or myself if you want to get more information.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if you can. Thanks for putting some of the resources in the chat, and we can also put them in the follow-up communication for people. I want to do a round robin, starting with Jody, because, so for HR practitioners, leaders are so busy and always so involved with transactional work, firefighting, all these things. So I'd love to hear one tip from each of you. How can HR professionals very tangibly and tactically get started with org design? Jody, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Well, based on the way you've described it, which sounds very real, Nicole, HR people are the busiest people. Yep. And the role is maybe the most demanding one that I can think of. So I'm always thinking, well, how do you try and get started with org design when you're already in some kind of project? So based on what we've been talking about, I'm thinking about when you start a project or a kind of change management initiative, it doesn't even have to be organization design, but try and build in those ways to engage with more people. And you've probably got the skill set to do that already, to facilitate workshops or to conduct interviews or to collect testimonials, as Seema has mentioned. But I think one of the big tips is don't think that you have to wait until all the decisions are made and the project is done. And Cynthia talked about that as well. It's actually easier in the diagnosis phase to pull in more people when you're really saying we're just looking at the problem here, because then you don't have, it's not as scary perhaps to leaders who are worried about not having the solution on hand. Because if you go into the mode to say we're just looking at describing what the situation is today, And we really want to involve a lot of people in understanding what does it feel like to work in this organization today. Then my experience has been that that's a super well-received effort. People really appreciate being involved, and you're actually starting your change management already from day one.
Thank you so much. Seema, what's your one tip?
My one tip is to be at the table when strategy is being discussed where possible, or if you're not as well versed. I've met a lot of HR leaders who are very clear on business strategy and others who are not in the room, right? So they don't have a strong grasp. But I think recognizing business strategy and having the discussion with colleagues around what are the workforce implications, right? If this is where the business is going, are we ready for that? So just having the dialogue around workforce implications based on whatever the strategy is, and if possible, be in the room so that you could also in real time challenge leaders to think about that and talk about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then Cynthia.
Yeah, and I saw the notes here too about potentially getting into the, how do you get into the field? And there are a lot of, there's a lot of complementary areas, you know, as you think about transition management, change management, if you're an agile coach or you're looking into this area, I found that the change and transition management and organization design, like somebody said before, go hand in hand. So that's something that is something to look into. You see a lot of practitioners in that area. And the thing that I learned as an HR business partner is I started small. So I just started with, if I'm developing this OD expertise, I started with a group, and I started with a staff, and then it went to a division, and then it went into geography, and then it went to enterprise. So you get small wins along the way, you try things. And this is what I think design thinking also really helps, because you're very experimental in how you approach just different projects and what part of the organization am I impacting? Is it the structure? Is it metrics? Is it process? So what and how is it then how can I help, to what Seema talked about, support the organizational intent and the strategic intent of that group, of that business, of that region? And so that's something to think through.
Super. Thank you so much to all of you. And I just want to close us out with a little design thinking final activity, because in design thinking, we do things and then we reflect on what we did. So I want all of you to think about one key takeaway from today's session and put them in the chat, please. What's your one key takeaway from this session? Looks like people are thinking. There we go. Thanks, Melissa, for kicking us off. Designing around a person is not org design. Yeah, that's one of the things when I was at Accenture, even though I was not in org design, that was one of the first things I learned. Liz, you need to engage as many people as possible in the process. Yes. Thank you. You can apply design thinking to almost anything. Yes, you may. What else? You can apply org design at the team level. Yes. Have the end in mind thinking brings communication to the front. Yes. Thank you, Bill. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to let you all go because I know it's at the end of Friday. Thanks for being such good sports. Thanks again to our amazing panelists. I learned so much about org design. And thank you again, Liz and Proco, for sponsoring us. Bye, and see you at a future HR Hackathon Alliance event.